Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first event of the Humanities Forum this semester. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here and the director of the forum. Welcome again. We have a wonderful series of events planned for this semester. Please keep an eye open for our email announcements, and you can always check our semester schedule on our website. It's now my pleasure to ask you to welcome with me Father Isaac Morales, a member of the Theology Department here at PC and currently the chair of the department, who will introduce today's special guest and the context for today's event.
Thanks, Dr. Hain. I'm a little bit shorter, so I'll put this down a bit. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Humanities Forum of the semester. In addition to being the first Humanities Forum, it is also the first event co-sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Fellowship. And what, you may ask, is the C.S. Lewis Fellowship? I'm glad you asked. The C.S. Lewis Fellowship is a new project recently founded, literally this month, under the auspices of the Humanities Program. And the mission of the C.S. Lewis Fellowship is to promote the teaching of the writings of C.S. Lewis at both the secondary and the post-secondary level. And now the project is obviously very much in its infancy, literally not even 1 month old, but we have a number of initiatives planned to promote this mission. One will be to offer mini grants to high school teachers as well as professors to develop syllabi and course units related to the writings of Lewis. Another will be an annual essay contest with a cash prize for first and second place. So those of you who are in the Lewis class might want to keep that in mind as you're writing your essays this semester. And lectures such as today's lecture. And I cannot think of a better speaker to kick off our C.S. Lewis Fellowship than the Reverend Dr. Michael Ward. Around 12 years ago, in January of 2011, I was noticing in a number of those lists of best reads of 2010, a book with the title Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And the title intrigued me, so I picked up the book and I read it. And it was one of the most fascinating books I have ever read. And Dr. Ward did not pay me a penny, either British or American, to say that. That is my genuine opinion of the book. Not long afterwards, in early of 2012, I was fortunate enough to meet the author in the flesh. And I was happy to discover that not only is he a first-rate Lewis scholar, he is also a delightful human being. So Michael Ward is a member of the faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, as well as professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. He has authored a number of essays and articles on C.S. Lewis, as well as the Inklings, this literary circle that seemed to revolve around Lewis, as well as a number of books. In addition to Planet Narnia, he has written the Narnia Code, which is a popularized version of the thesis. He is the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. And his most recent book is titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And over lunch today, he was telling us of the next book to come out with the delightful title, Popcorn with the Pope. He is a contributor to a series of essays that gives film reviews of significant movies. Today, he is also, in addition to being a Lewis scholar, he's also a priest of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. And today he's going to be speaking to us, giving us this lecture titled, The Heavens Are Telling the Glory of God, C.S. Lewis, Narnia, and Medieval Cosmology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ward.
Thank you, Isaac. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be with you. This is my first visit to Providence College, though not my first visit to Providence. I came a few years ago to speak at that place called Brown. I'm staying at the Graduate Hotel, by the way, and they give you cards to get in and out of your room. And I notice I've got a picture of Emma Watson on my card. She was a graduate of Brown, is that right? Yes, Hermione from Harry Potter. What a strange way to mark your success in the acting profession. Anyway, that's totally irrelevant to anything I had planned to say. Let me focus on the topic of this afternoon's lecture. I'll speak for about 55 minutes, I hope no longer than that, and then we can have Q&A and discussion for the rest of the time. But let's start out, as the title of the lecture indicates, with the heavens, which are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. So says the psalmist in the opening verses of Psalm 19, which C.S. Lewis described as the greatest poem in the Psalter, and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And it's about Lewis's understanding of the heavens, and in particular, the medieval understanding of the seven heavens that I want to speak to you today, and their particular connection to his Chronicles of Narnia, the works for which he is best known. These books were published one per year from 1950 to 1956. They soon established themselves as popular favorites, and they're still selling incredibly well now, 70-odd years after they first came out. They're now translated into over 40 languages, selling several million copies annually every year. An amazing literary success. And I'm assuming that quite a few of you here in the audience today have read at least one of these books. They are fantastically popular, not just in the Christian world, but in the secular world. They have become mainstream classics of English children's fiction. And it's worth, therefore, our spending a little bit of time trying to analyze them and work out what's going on in these books. Just because they're for children doesn't mean that they are beneath adult attention. At least that was Lewis's view. And you know the Jesuit maxim, give me a boy until he's 7 and I will show you the man. The sorts of stories that we read and immerse ourselves in when we are young have a very formative effect upon our imagination, upon our expectations of the world and our place in it. Plato said in the Republic that the beginning is the biggest part of any work, and therefore in that work, which is the construction of the human person, it's especially important that children should hear good fables and not bad ones. To what extent are the Narnia Chronicles good fables? When Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to his great friend J.R.R.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien, strongly reacted against what he was hearing. Tolkien disliked the draft version that Lewis read to him. He couldn't understand why Lewis should have put so many disparate elements, so many diverse literary and mythological traditions in a single story. You have English children straight out of the pages of an E. Nesbit kind of book. You have centaurs and fauns and dryads and naiads out of Greek and Roman mythology. You have a white witch character fresh from a Hans Andersen fairy tale. You have Father Christmas, for goodness sake, what's he doing in this story? And Tolkien thought this was not how an imagined world should be constructed. And if you know Tolkien's Middle-earth, you know that his sub-created realm is polished to the nth degree of perfection, with whole languages and genealogies and cartographies and appendices, so that wherever you strike the world of Middle-earth, it rings true with this inner consistency of reality. And Tolkien thought that Narnia lacked that. He thought they were, relatively speaking, a hodgepodge, a mishmash. Not that he knew Narnia very well. In fact, he was so uninterested in the books that he soon gave up trying to read them. I'm not sure he read even all of them once, let alone repeatedly. So his familiarity with Narnia was actually relatively slight. But because Tolkien has become so famous, his attitude to Narnia has become very well known too. Lots of people have assumed that Tolkien was much more intimately connected to the writing of these books than he actually was. But on the face of it, Tolkien's objection is valid, isn't it? I mean, we can't dispute the fact that Narnia does seem to be assembled out of very various literary and mythological traditions. I mean, that's just a fact. The next question, therefore, becomes, well, does that constitute a mishmash, or is there some sort of unity underneath this apparent slapdash and haphazard assemblage? And because there is a clear biblical, allegorical element to the stories, a lot of people have assumed, well, that provides the series with unity and pattern and imaginative logic. Lewis himself once said that the whole series was about Christ. The whole Narnia series, he said, is about Christ. And the Christ character, Aslan, the Lion King, is the only character who appears in all 7 books. And he's certainly very Christ-like, especially in these 3. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe gives you the Narnian Gospel account, as it were. The Magician's Nephew gives you the Narnian Genesis account. And the Last Battle gives you the Narnian version of the Apocalypse and the Final Judgment. So the biblical parallels in these 3 stories are very clear and evident. You can't really miss them if you've got any biblical knowledge at all. But these are only 3 out of 7 books. What about the other 4? When you turn to the other 4 Chronicles and ask, well, how are these about Christ? It's a little less obvious how that might be so. I mean, yeah, Aslan's still central, at least logically. He's the most important character, even if he doesn't appear very often. And he's still Christ-like in various ways, guiding people, challenging people, teaching people, forgiving people. But there's no major element or episode of Christ's life and ministry or his divine office that is being reimagined in these 4 stories. I mean, you might have expected, given what Lewis has done in these 3, you might have expected these 4 to be built upon other major biblical scenarios, like a whole Narnia story about the conception and birth of the Christ character. You don't get that. You don't get a Narnian equivalent of the ascension of the Christ character, or of the day of Pentecost when Christ's Spirit is sent on the church. Why not? I mean, these are questions you don't necessarily ask yourself, of course, when you're young. By the way, I'm very pleased to see the age range represented in this audience today. We have a boy at the back who looks like he might be as old as 4 or 5, and I'm told there's a man in the audience who is possibly in his 70s. No? And I'm pleased. I think this speaks to the universality of the fairy tale genre. It's not just for the children, it's for all of us. But when you're just enjoying these books, at whatever age you're reading them, you're not typically asking yourself literary critical questions about how the story hangs together and how the biblical parallels work out in each book. You just accept what you're given and you enjoy it or not, as the case may be. But in an academic setting like this, when we're deliberately assembling in order to ask some critical questions, these are questions that we should ask. How does Narnia hang together? It doesn't seem to make very much sense at the purely literary level. When we assess the biblical parallels, well, 3 books are obviously very biblical and 4 much less so. There doesn't seem to be any very coherent allegorizing system or imaginative blueprint that Lewis is working to. So what's going on? Well, at this point, some people throw up their hands and they just say, well, these are books that are just for the children. Lewis dashed them off in a few years. We shouldn't take them that seriously. The problem with that, I think, is that, well, the books have become so fantastically popular and successful. I mean, is that really how great canonical works of English children's fiction are written? Almost accidentally, without much care and forethought, without much appeal to the deeper springs of the imagination. I mean, if that is so, that itself requires explanation, I think. But I don't think that is so. I think there is another explanation awaiting our attention. And I'm not the first person who has suggested that there might be more going on in Narnia than meets the eye. Lots of other Lewis scholars and critics have suggested, well, we know Lewis to have been so interested in complexity and intricacy that although Narnia seems a bit haphazard, both at the literary level and at the biblical parallel level, there must be something else that he's working to. And he was indeed very interested in complexity. He was a medievalist, of course, and he said that the medieval mind is a mind that is especially enamored of complexity. The works of writers like Chaucer and Dante and Spencer and Milton, in these authors, he says, everything leads to everything else, but often by very intricate paths. Complexity is a mark of the medieval mind, he says. And as a medievally minded scholar himself, I think we might expect him to imitate the workings of the authors that he respected so much and studied so closely. And so various theories have been advanced about what really ties the Narnia books together. The 7 deadly sins, for instance, has been offered. 2 scholars, independently of each other, came up with that idea. And we know Lewis to have been interested in the 7 deadly sins. He wrote a poem about the 7 deadly sins, so maybe that's the answer. The only problem with this theory is that these 2 scholars assigned different sins to different books. So that theory never got off the ground. Maybe it's the 7 sacraments that gives these stories coherence. 7 Catholic sacraments, except that Lewis wasn't a Catholic. He was an Anglican, and Anglicans have 2 sacraments, not 7. So that theory didn't get very far. The 7 books of Spenser's Faerie Queene, the 7 virtues, almost any 7 that people can think of have been proffered as keys to the Narnia series, except the one 7 which is all over Lewis's work, namely the 7 heavens. And it fell to me, for some reason, to be the first person to advance this theory seriously. And that's what, as Isaac said in his introduction, my book, Planet Narnia, is all about, and the popular version, the Narnia Code. So what I'm going to be giving you in the remaining time is basically a distillation of Planet Narnia, or even just a distillation of the Narnia Code, because we don't have very long to go into the details. And if you've read one or other or both of these books, you may wish to leave now, because I won't be saying much that you haven't read. Nonetheless, I think it's a very interesting and intriguing thing that Lewis did, not just from a literary point of view, but from a theological point of view. And that will be our twin-track approach, literature and theology, in what remains. But first, let's just say a little bit about... Oh, someone has read the books. Okay. Just a quick word about Lewis himself. Because here I'm going to be advancing the case that Lewis had a hidden imaginative blueprint to Narnia that he told nobody about, and that even close friends like Tolkien didn't spot, and that I managed to divine 60 or so years after the fact. I mean, that's quite a large claim. You'd be right to be a bit skeptical. I think I would be skeptical if someone came to me with such a claim. But the evidence, when you begin to examine it, stacks up intriguingly. But the first thing to get over is the fact that Lewis could have kept such a thing secret. Now, Lewis was a very secretive man. Jack never ceased to be secretive, according to George Sayer, who wrote a biography of C.S. Lewis. You know, I'm sure, that Jack was Lewis's nickname. Clive Staples were his real names, but he didn't like either Clive or Staples, so he was always known as Jack. And Jack never ceased to be secretive, according to this George Sayer, who knew him for 30 years, both as a student and as a friend. He never ceased to be secretive. Well, if we're looking for examples of his secretiveness, the most obvious is the fact that when he got married in his late 50s, I think some of you last night saw the Shadowlands movie about his late marriage. When he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year. Not even close friends like Tolkien were told that he had got married. And this is an extraordinary thing to do. The whole point of a marriage is that it's a public relationship. But Lewis got married privately. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many important things about his early life that one of his friends jokingly said, it should not have been called Surprised by Joy, it should have been called Suppressed by Jack. And there are many other examples that we could point to of his capacity for secretiveness, privacy, guardedness, and so on. But that will have to suffice for now. This is the man we're dealing with. In other words, it should not surprise us that there may be more going on in Narnia than meets the eye. But before I come on to the main substance of what I'm going to argue, let me just give you some quick background considerations. One of them theological, one of them literary, and one of them historical. And the theological background point has to do with Christology. We've already said that Lewis regarded Narnia as all about Christ. And when we hear him say that, we immediately think of Aslan doing his Christ-like things. But take a look at this verse from Colossians, which Lewis was interested in. For all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together. Lewis paraphrased this verse in one of his books. He paraphrased it as, Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Narnia is all about Christ. How would Lewis depict an all-pervasive principle of cohesion in his Narnian world? This very claim about the all-pervasive cohesiveness of the Christological principle is something that is actually rather hard to get our heads round. Because if all things hold together in Christ, then our very understanding of Christ is held together in Christ. And that means we can never, as it were, get outside Christ. We can never step back from him, this Christ-drenched universe, and look at it from a Christ-less vantage point. There is no such vantage point, because all things hold together in Christ. Lewis says this in his book Miracles, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, namely God, the Trinitarian God of Christian theology, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one that is most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. And that is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. The divine has been forgotten because it's the ground of all our forgetting, and all our knowing, and all our observing, and all our being. It's the absolute premise, and therefore is presupposed in all our thinking and doing and being. We overlook it because it's the very means by which we look, so to speak. Familiarity breeds contempt. So how would C.S. Lewis depict an all-pervasive but overlookable Christological principle in Narnia, if, indeed, he was going to try to do so? Keep that question in your mind. That's the theological background point. Secondly, a literary background point, the kappa element in romance. Now, this is the title of an essay that Lewis wrote. Kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, which means cryptic or hidden. So the title of his essay basically means the hidden element in story. That's what romance means here. Lewis wrote an essay called The Hidden Element in Story. The trouble is, he never published it under this title, and so most people don't know that it exists. It exists in note form under this title, and then he wrote up those notes and published it under a different title, and he dropped the term kappa out of the fully worked essay, though the thing itself continued to be his concern. And the fully worked out version of the essay was called On Stories, and in On Stories he says this: to be stories at all, stories must be series of events. But it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or a quality. Now, it's this state or quality which in the draft version of this essay he had called the kappa element, the cryptic element, the hidden element. Why is it hidden? because it's in the whole of the story. It's not just in the plot. It's in the background descriptions. It's in the whole tone and flavor of the world, not just in the sequence of events. There are stories which are principally sequences of events. Think of a typical whodunit murder mystery, an Agatha Christie, say. You tend not to reread Agatha Christie unless you've forgotten who did the murder. Because Agatha Christie, though a brilliant writer in her own genre, is not giving you, typically, very carefully worked atmospheric worlds. She's not giving you three-dimensional characterizations. She's giving you a very clever plot, and that's mostly what she's giving you. Whereas another novelist, like Jane Austen, for instance, will give you a very cleverly worked plot in, say, Pride and Prejudice, but she'll also give you very fully realized characters and fully realized worlds in which these characters move. Regency England and Bath and that whole early 19th century upper middle class world. And so you will reread Pride and Prejudice many times, even though you can remember the plot. At least speaking for myself, I've now read Pride and Prejudice 4 or 5 times. I can remember well enough that Elizabeth Bennet marries Mr. Darcy. Sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody. But I don't care. I'm not now reading for the plot. I'm reading because I just like living in that world, imaginatively speaking. Because Jane Austen gives you a state or a quality, a sort of epiphenomenal tone or flavor, which is in every part of the story, not just in the sequence of events. It's the ostentatious flavor of her world, as it has been called. Except it's not very ostentatious. It's hidden, because it's woven into every part of the world. You can close Pride and Prejudice and reflect upon it afterwards. You can ask yourself, well, how did Jane Austen achieve that conjuration of magic? But while you're living the story, while you're reading the work, because you're inside her imaginative world, it's effectively hidden from you by the fact that it is all-pervasive. So you see here in the kappa element in romance, what we've got is a kind of literary equivalent of the Christological principle that I talked about in the first background point. So again, in Narnia, is Lewis trying to give us a kappa element, a pervasive flavor or tone in each of the Chronicles? Our third background point is historical, and it relates to this technique that Lewis identifies called transferred classicism. This is a technique, he said, that writers, Christian writers, used as late as the 17th century. Christian writers would reach back into the classical pagan past, and they would find in Greek and Roman mythology all sorts of classical gods and goddesses and tropes and motifs and themes, and they would transfer them into their Christian poetry. Not because they still worshipped the classical pantheon of gods, but because they found them useful. They could exploit them for literary and imaginative purposes. And this is the best way, Lewis says, of writing literature which is religious without being devotional. You can take Zeus and Venus and Apollo and whoever it may be, transfer them into your Christian art, and explore all sorts of spiritual and religious and moral themes, but not in a way which requires the reader to, fall to his knees and pray. It's not that kind of work. God, the Christian God, Lewis says, will often appear in medieval and Renaissance literature, but masked, hidden behind a pagan veil, dressed up as Zeus or Jupiter or whoever it may be. And everyone is in the secret, he says. Everybody knows that this is what's going on. So that's our historical background point, hiding the Christian God behind a pagan veil. Now we can return to Narnia and how it hangs together, if it does. And at this point we should remind ourselves that although Lewis is best known for Narnia, and then secondarily for works of Christian apologetics like Mere Christianity and so on, He wasn't professionally a writer of either fiction or Christian apologetics. He was professionally an academic who studied at Oxford for most of his, studied and taught at Oxford for most of his career, finished his time as professor of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, and the biggest book he ever wrote was this, English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. Snappy title if ever there was one, I think you will agree. And it was part of a multi-volume series of books called the Oxford History of English Literature, which Lewis abbreviated to Oh Hell. He always referred to this as his Oh Hell book. It took him 15 years to write, and when it came out, he said, thank goodness I've finished this massive intellectual enterprise which I've been engaged in for the last 15 years. And then he adds, it was the top tune all that time. And all the other books I published during those years were just its little twiddly bits. In other words, Narnia is the twiddly bits upon this massive academic undertaking. And I put this up because this Oh Hell volume begins not with a discussion of hell, but with a discussion of the heavens, with a discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century, thanks to Nicholas Copernicus. And Lewis opens his literary history of the 16th century with astronomy because he wants to see how the new cosmology will affect the literature of the period. Because, of course, the kind of cosmos you believe yourself to be living in will have a major effect upon the sorts of art you produce. We now live, roughly speaking, in an Einsteinian cosmos, and a lot of Einsteinian ideas about relativity and incommensurability feed down into the wider culture and into the art and the literature that is produced in our day. The two are always in a relationship. And it's a subject that occupied a lot of Lewis's attention. It's something he returned to in his last academic book, The Discarded Image, where 3 times he encourages his readers to take a walk under the sky at night, looking up at the night sky, as if they still believed in the pre-Copernican geocentric universe. Earth, static and central, and surrounded by the 7 heavens, that of the moon, then Mercury's heaven, then the 3rd heaven, Venus, and the brightest heaven of invention, the sun, and Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are the 7 heavens, the 7 planets, each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the earth and people and events and even the metals in Earth's crust. And this is how the universe was believed to be, or at least, this is a slightly more detailed diagram of it. And this is the image that we've discarded. That's why Lewis calls his book The Discarded Image. We no longer believe the universe to be like this. We believe in a heliocentric, not a geocentric system. But Lewis hadn't discarded it because he wanted to retain an awareness of it in the minds of his readers and his students. Because, of course, you can't really understand medieval literature and art if you don't understand this cosmological backdrop. I mean, how can you read, for instance, Dante without knowing this system? Here's an illustration from the Divine Comedy. In the Paradiso, the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens in his ascent to God's throne, and here are the 7 gods and goddesses in the order of the days of the week. Of course, it is from the 7 heavens that we take the names of the days of the week. Clear how Saturday and Saturn are related, and Sun and Sunday, and Moon and Monday. The other 4 days of the week too, of course, take their names from the relevant governing planet, but it's a bit hidden from us in English. It's clearer if you think in Spanish. But back to Dante, the sun in his burning fiery chariot for Sunday, the moon for Monday in her silvery gown holding her crescent, the warrior in his helmet and his chain mail for Tuesday, Mars, the god of war, Martes, Miércoles for Wednesday with his wings on his heels, Jupiter for Thursday, Jueves, with his kingly staff of office over his shoulder, because Jupiter is the king above all things, the monarchical symbol. Venus in her green gown for Friday, Venus, the sponsor of fertility and creativity and love, when you venerate someone, you're doing something because Venus is inspiring your veneration. When you contract a venereal disease, you're also being inspired by Venus, but in a less wholesome fashion. And finally, Saturn for Saturday, with his sickle, cutting people down, because Saturn is associated with death and disaster and old age. So Dante uses these 7 planetary personalities very explicitly in his poetry, and so does Chaucer. Here's a page of notes I found in C.S. Lewis's handwriting. He's making notes here about Chaucer's The Knight's Tale. You see at the top, The Knight's Tale. We don't have time to explore this planetary diagram on the left, but Lewis was interested in the way that Chaucer used the planetary characters in The Knight's Tale. He said Chaucer didn't just put them as actors into the story, but wove the appropriate influences into the plot of The Knight's Tale. So that, for instance, the climax of the story happens on a Tuesday, on the day of Mars. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this historical, literary, critical appreciation of how the planets have been used in the Middle Ages. We've already touched upon his love for the 19th Psalm, but he was also quite a keen amateur astronomer, actually. He liked going to the local observatory. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. And he used the planets himself in his own fiction. You may have read the Ransom trilogy, sometimes incorrectly called the Space trilogy. Here they are. We don't have time to go into these, but if you have read these, you will know how very much they are dependent upon a medieval understanding of the planetary qualities. Why was Lewis so interested in this old system? Well, he said the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn, we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? Now, this is an absolutely crucial quotation for my whole argument about Narnia, because this shows us that Lewis regards the 7 heavens as not just some antiquated historical curiosity fit for those superstitious medieval types. No, he's saying they are permanently valuable spiritual symbols. They're like archetypes in the human imagination that recur across generations. Like 7 categories, 7 pigeonholes, the 7 colors of the rainbow into which you can slot all of human experience, from birth under Venus all the way through to death under Saturn and everything in between. And indeed, he says they are especially worthwhile in his own generation. His own generation, of course, being that which went through the First World War. That's why he says, of Saturn we know more than enough. Lewis was a teenage officer in the British Army during the Great War and was very nearly killed in the trenches of France. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in that conflict. The Saturnine shadow cast over Lewis's generation, Saturn with his sickle cutting people down, was all too familiar a figure, symbolically speaking. And Lewis sometimes talks about the culture of the 1920s and 30s as Saturnocentric, fixated upon Saturnine qualities of death and disaster and cynicism and pessimism. A very natural response to the trauma of the Great War that everyone had recently gone through, but not an eternal truth about the nature of the universe as far as he was concerned. Yes, we cannot deny the Saturnine influences that fall upon us, so to speak, but is Saturn the only way of conceiving of spiritual reality? Is Saturn the most important? No. Who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter the king? So when Lewis came to write the Narnia books, I believe he used these 7 spiritual symbols again, which he had spent so much of his life and career writing about, studying, thinking about, indeed working with in his own imaginative fiction and in his poetry. In all of that previous work, he'd discussed the planets explicitly, avowedly, directly. Here in Narnia, I believe, he takes them again, but uses them implicitly, secretly, privately. in order to give each chronicle both a kappa element, a pervasive tone or flavor, which he thought was an essential part of good storytelling. But intriguingly, he uses that kappa element also to serve his Christological purposes, so that Aslan, the Christ character, sums up in his own person that pervasive, qualitative influence, which otherwise is spread abroad across the rest of the tale so large that you can't see it, but he condenses it. He incarnates it, you might say, in his own person, Aslan does. Now, we haven't got much time left to go through all 7 books, so I won't even try, at least not in any detail. But let's just very quickly look at the first 3 books in some measure of detail, and then we'll just quickly list the remaining 4, just to show you how I think this plan works out. And of course, there's much, much more that could be said, but here we go. Here's Jupiter, the planet, and there in the southeast corner, you can just make out the great red spot of Jupiter, the great eye, which is a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter. The diameter of that storm alone is greater than the diameter of Earth. You could fit the whole of our planet inside just that little corner of Jupiter. It shows you how massive Jupiter is. And here is Jupiter, the king of the gods, Jupiter in Roman mythology, or Zeus in Greek, Thor, roughly speaking, in Norse mythology. Now, I was lying in bed one night, halfway through my PhD researches. I was examining Lewis's theological imagination. I wasn't focusing on Narnia. I was looking at something else entirely, Lewis's implicit mode of communication, how he said things through implication, not directly. That was my focus for my PhD research. But I happened, in the course of that work, to be reading Lewis's long poem about the planets, which he wrote in 1935, so 15 years before Narnia came out. And in that poem, The Planets, he gives a beautiful poetic description of each of the 7 heavens. And then I got to these lines about Jupiter and did a double take, because I read that of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven, and good fortune, Jove is master. And that caused me to do a double take, because of especially those 5 words, winter past and guilt forgiven. Because, of course, that's like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You remember the White Witch has made it always winter, never Christmas. But her kingdom of ice and snow passes at the coming of Aslan. We're told that when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And guilt is forgiven. Edmund, the traitor, his guilt is forgiven by Aslan's sacrificial death on the stone table. I thought to myself. And I began to look a bit more closely at Lewis's understanding of Jupiter and its possible connection to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Jupiter is the king. That's his principal quality. But, Lewis says, we must think of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene, tranquil, festive, magnanimous, prosperous. That's the kind of jovial kingship that the medievals principally were occupied with. And think of Aslan in this first Narnia story. The children don't know who he is in this first tale. They think he might just be a regular man, but they're told, Aslan a man? He's the king of the wood. That's the very first description given of him. He's the king of the beasts. He's not good. He's not safe, but he's good because he's the king. He's the true king. He has these kingly accoutrements of royal pavilions and standards, and he ends up crowning the children too. They become kings and queens. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia, we're told repeatedly. And then I thought more closely about the sacrificial element of Aslan's death and resurrection. What's that got to do with Jupiter? Isn't that just a sort of convenient Sunday school lesson? An obvious biblical parallel hoiked in to make his fairy tale edifying for his young readers? Well, the same year Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he published another book on the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams. And in that book, Lewis says this about Williams's poetry. When Williams writes of Jupiter's red pierced planet, Williams assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype of the divine king wounded on Calvary, which shows us very explicitly, undeniably, that Lewis makes a connection between jovial symbolism and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which he's reworking in the death and resurrection of Aslan on the stone table. Interesting. Is it possible that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is deliberately constructed to communicate jovial symbolism? Maybe, but let's just, for the moment, think that it arose unbidden to Lewis's mind, that he was so steeped in this imagery that it sort of came to his pen automatically, without much deliberation. Yeah, but when you turn to the next chronicle, Prince Caspian, you find that this is strangely informed by martial symbolism. Prince Caspian is a war story, we're told. It's the civil war of Narnia, the great war of deliverance. And if you saw the recent film version, which I rather hope you didn't, you may remember how they went to town on the battle scenes in this film version. The very word martial appears twice in this book, just as a tiny little tip-off, if we were in any doubt. But aside from all the military events, the campaign to expel the usurping king Miraz and the skirmishes and the battles and the single combat and all the rest of it, in addition to that, you have another strong strain of imagery running through this story, which has to do not with warfare, but with woods and forests. And in Roman mythology, Mars was not always and only the god of war. He was originally a vegetation deity. He was known as Mars Silvanus. Here's a mural from Pompeii, which shows you Mars in both capacities at once. The god of war, yes, with his shield and his spear and his helmet, but he's standing against a backdrop of burgeoning vegetation because he was both things at once. And that's why, incidentally, we call the third month of the year March. March is sacred to Mars because in that period of the year, the weather is getting good enough for armies to march off to battle, yes, but the trees are also coming back to life. So look at this image from Prince Caspian. It shows you both martial influences in a single shot. A single combat in the foreground and in the background, the gathering tree spirits. And it's only in Prince Caspian, incidentally, that these tree spirits are called Sylvans. Lewis is tipping us the wink to Mars Silvanus. And Aslan, of course, sums up those qualities in his own person. He is the one who gives the great roar, the war cry, summoning all the faithful Narnians to battle, but he's also the one in whose presence the trees come alive. Lucy tries to wake the trees, you remember, but they only start to move and dance when Aslan is there, because he's the true Mars. Think in biblical terms. The Lord of hosts, mighty in battle, that's a good description of God from one perspective. Think also of the trees of the field clapping their hands. Another aspect of the divine nature manifest through vegetation. But even seemingly random details also bespeak the martial tone. Remember at the start of the story, they discover a little chess piece in the ruins of the castle. And what is that chess piece? It could have been a chess king or a chess pawn or a chess queen. What is it? A chess knight with a little red ruby eye. It has to be a knight, just as Chaucer's Knight's Tale had to conclude on a Tuesday, because the influences are working through every part of the story. Nothing is random. Nothing is slapdash, actually. It's all minutely imagined, but with a superficial appearance of hodgepodge, for reasons that we will come back to in a moment. But just speeding on to the next chronicle, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This is the Sun book, the solar story, full of gold and sunlight and a journey to the very place of the rising sun, the eastern edge of the world, where the ship treads the dawn. All that gold imagery and light imagery is pretty obvious, I hope, if you've got any memory of the book at all. But what I think clinches the solar connection is the theme of dragons in this story. The ship itself is shaped like a dragon. Eustace, you remember, is turned into a dragon and then undragoned. And what's that, you might say, but again, a convenient Sunday school lesson about the process of regeneration and conversion. Well, it might be that, but why couch it in dragonish terms? There are other ways in which you can talk about conversion. Lewis chooses dragons because he's drawing upon the Greek god of light, Apollo Sauroctonus, the lizard slayer, the dragon slayer. If you know your Homer's hymn to Apollo deals with just such a situation of the slaying of a dragon by Apollo. And if you remember the film version, which again, I sincerely hope you never saw. But this is a still from the terrible film version of The Dawn Treader. Here's Eustace's eyeball after he's been turned into a dragon, and in the reflection in his eye, you can just see the approaching figure of Aslan, who's going to come and undragon him and rip off the thick, dark, knobbly skin and turn him back into a boy again. Because this is Aslan performing in the role of Apollo Sauroctonus. But he's also the one who, at the eastern edge of the world, scatters light from his mane. He's the bird flying in the sunbeam that Lucy sees in the dark island, and so on and so forth. I am the light of the world, Jesus says in John's Gospel. All this symbolism is entirely consistent with biblical theology. The King of Kings, Lord of Lords for Jupiter, the Lord of Hosts, mighty in battle for Mars. I am the light of the world for the sun. But Lewis doesn't just start and stop with the biblical material. He goes a long way round through classical mythology and medieval astrology, enriching his biblical material as he goes, which is one of the reasons why I think Narnia is so satisfying as a read, because there are all these resonances and echoes and allusions and connotations going all the time to every part of European history. Lewis read everything and remembered everything. It was once said of him after his death. He had a photographic memory. So all these things came to him, yes, almost unbidden, but only after he'd selected, in this case, the sun as his governing imaginative principle. Then, like iron filings, everything in his memory suddenly configured themselves in that direction, and he was able to write the book with remarkable ease and speed, as he did. Apparently, he wrote The Dawn Treader in a burst of creativity that lasted only a fortnight. Amazing. The Silver Chair is the moon book for, I hope, some obvious reasons, not least of which is that the moon's metal is silver, but this is a story about wetness and wanderings and lunacy and so forth. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury story in which Aslan is swift of foot, we're told. He runs around so quickly that he's mistaken for 2 lions or possibly 3 lions, because he's, in this book, the Word of God, living and active. And in The Magician's Nephew, he's the Venus spirit incarnate, singing Narnia into being, but also sending Diggory off to the Western Garden, where the magic life-giving apples are. And people tend to think, oh, that's the Garden of Eden. But, of course, it's much more the Garden of the Hesperides, which Lewis, as a classically trained scholar, knew all about. And the last battle, of course, is the Saturn book, in which Narnia is brought to an end by Father Time. And in Lewis's academic works, he talks about how Father Time, with his scythe and his hourglass, is based on earlier pictures of Saturn. They are the same character, mythologically speaking. There's a lot more, of course, that could be said, but we must draw to a close. If this theory is correct about Narnia, why would Lewis do it? I think one reason is simple fun, actually. We mustn't get too serious about this. I knew in Cambridge a chap an old man who had been a colleague of Lewis's in the 1950s in Cambridge. And I went and told him what I'd found, and he said, oh, that's exactly like Jack. Jack would have roared with laughter as he did all that. He thought that was entirely consistent with Lewis's playful personality. But more seriously, we have the literary considerations and the theological considerations. We have the kappa element, the hidden flavor or tone pervading a whole story, not just the sequence of events, but every part of the story, down to seemingly random little details like discarded chess pieces. That's the literary reason why Lewis would do it. And the theological reason is because the whole Narnia story is about Christ. And Christ as the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. So intimately woven with our entire experience that we overlook it. And here we come back to the planets and the heavens and the music of the spheres, this perpetual Gloria sung by the celestial bodies, which is inaudible on earth. Something Lewis touches upon in one of his academic lectures. He says this: the music of the spheres is the only sound which has never for one split second ceased in any part of the universe. With this positive, we have no negative to contrast. Presumably, if it ever did stop, then with terror and dismay, with a dislocation of our whole auditory life, we should feel that the bottom had dropped out of our lives. But it never does. The music, too familiar to be heard, enfolds us day and night and in all ages. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. That was an excellent presentation. We have about 15 or 20 minutes, give or take, for questions, and it is the custom of the forum to grant the first question to a student. So if there are any students out there who have a question for Dr. Ward.
Hi. First, thanks for coming here. Very appreciative. I'm a former student of Father Isaac in the C.S. Lewis class. My question is more around the kappa element. So I just personally have been researching. I know it's definitely a hubbub of college campuses. Artificial intelligence. I know that's a big leap, but I promise it circles back. Artificial intelligence, a lot of it, you talk about the kappa element and how romance has that kappa element, how there's a creativity that works through all things. And what I found with C.S. Lewis in his Mere Christianity is that God is he who tells us what we ought to do, not what we in fact do. And that's what our free will comes in. So I was just hoping if you could expand on kappa element as in, is that something that could be found from something that isn't human, that isn't a creation of God, that something created kind of holds within that at its essence, if I got that right.
Right. I'm not sure I followed quite the last link in that chain, but let me run with what I think might be a related answer, if not the exact answer you're looking for. And that is to do with your point about freedom, that human responsibility kicks in. God doesn't require us to do his will. God seeks that we do his will. That's, as you said, yeah? He tells us what we ought to do, not what we do. How might that relate to the planetary influence, and therefore to the kappa element? Well, yes, the influences, it was believed in the Middle Ages, only give you a disposition, a predisposition. They're not determinative. And indeed, the medieval church stood out against astrological determinism. They said that's one of the ways in which astrology can be abused. The stars, your horoscope, might give you a particular inclination to work to go in a certain direction, but it couldn't overrule your free will and your responsibility before God. And indeed, if you were born under a certain star, as it were, if you were born under Mars, you could take the planetary influence to excess. You could become cruel and violent and murderous, like Attila the Hun, for instance. That's an example Lewis gives. And if you think in terms of Prince Caspian, you may remember the hag and the werewolf who are prepared to do anything in order to achieve their war aims. You might say they're martial, but they're excessively martial. Whereas the Telmarines, the usurping forces under King Miraz, are insufficiently martial. They're rather dandified and languid and ill-disciplined. They don't have brightly shining armor and all the rest of it. Whereas the Narnian knights are right on the sweet spot, neither too much nor too little. They're taking the influence just as it should be received through their exercise of free will. And you see that in all the Chronicles, actually, to varying degrees, the extent to which the planetary influence is lived into or not, as the case may be. I don't think that really answered your question, but come and ask me again at the end afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. I was very interested when you described some of the other readings of the seven in the beginning. You said there was a Spencerian reading and a variety of other readings as well. And my question is, if we use sort of the planetary scheme that you describe as the overarching scheme, does that necessarily exclude those other readings? Or could Lewis, as an eclectic reader, an avid reader, someone who entertained a lot of ideas, could they be operating maybe on different levels at the same time, so that they're not necessarily inaccurate, they're just a different level of reading?
Well, they could be. In principle, I don't deny that that's theoretically possible. I don't actually think that is the case. Having looked very minutely at the books and these various theories, I don't think they really stack up very convincingly. I mean, I must confess, I myself once made a half-hearted attempt to link the Chronicles to different plays by Shakespeare, because there are lots of Shakespearean allusions going on in the books. But even where that works, it only sort of relates to one little bit of each story. It's not totalizing. It doesn't have much explanatory power beyond little points. And that's, I think, the merit of this argument, if it's accepted, that the whole point of it is that it's ubiquitous, omnipresent, you might, in a divine sense, but also in a literary sense. I mean, if anybody wanted to come along and say, well, nonetheless, it's still compatible with the 7 deadly sins, I would say to them, go ahead, knock yourself out. If you can show it, show it. I can't see it. And there's only so much that even a literary genius like Lewis can get into one relatively short story. Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you, Dr. Ward. This has been super interesting. I'm thinking about Charles Taylor makes the comment that in the shift to the modern age, we shift from a cosmos to a universe, from sort of this ordered understanding of reality to an understanding of the universe as dead matter or whatever. Via C.S. Lewis, how might it be that we can order our imaginations to, I take it this is your goal, to think about how, and in his goal, this idea of spiritual symbols that can still shape our imaginations and lives. How can we see the world as an ordered cosmos and still benefit from the spiritual symbols of the stars and the planets today?
Good question. And the answer is, or an answer is, I think, implicit in Lewis's whole strategy with Narnia. I think, in fact, I gestured in this direction at one point in my talk, and I didn't come back to it, but I can come back to it now, that there's a superficial appearance of chaos or a superficial appearance of relative lack of design in Narnia, which Tolkien and others have pointed to. And in my brief descriptions of the biblical parallels, even there, the lack of design is evident. And Lewis, I think, was deliberate in giving an ostensible chaos. I mean, let's use the strongest term available. He was prepared for the books to be thought of as lacking design. Now, I think that's one of the most interesting things about this whole project, from an imaginative point of view, because Lewis is to Narnia as God is to the real world. Lewis has created Narnia. Everything that happens in Narnia happens by his will. And yet, he doesn't impose his will so irresistibly upon his material as to make it obvious. The characters in the story have to fight to realize themselves under the influences which are pervading their story, and we, the readers, have had to fight to discern his authorial purposes from outside the story. Now, I think that's quite possibly a very crafty, deep-laid, long-fuse apologetic strategy. You think Narnia is a chaos? Well, I, myself, C.S. Lewis, used to think that the universe itself was chaotic. You see how he opens his book, The Problem of Pain, with a long, long paragraph about how not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anybody had said to me, "Why do you not believe in God?" I would have said, "Look at the universe we live in. Most of it is pitch black and cold and deathly dark, and those parts of it which have life, the life is predicated upon predation and mortality and pain. And you say this is the work of an omnibenevolent God? I say all the evidence points in precisely the opposite direction." That was his atheistic stance. And of course, he came to belief in Christ and completely reversed that view and thought, no, despite all appearances to the contrary, there is a loving creator behind all the vicissitudes of history and the inexplicable events and the accidents and the innocent suffering and all the rest of it. Somehow there is, a divine hand on the tiller of history, and God is working his purposes out, etc., etc. But God doesn't make it easy. The eye of faith is required. And that, I think, is in a way what Lewis is challenging his readers to develop themselves. You think Narnia is a hodgepodge? Well, don't laugh too soon. You think the world is a hodgepodge? Don't laugh too soon. Things are more complicated than you may realize. And, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. I think all of that is probably playing in the background of Lewis's mind as he does this, as he allows himself even to be misinterpreted by a close friend like Tolkien. I think that's genius. And speaks also to Lewis's humility.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. That was wonderful. If I can return for just a moment to Tolkien's opinion of Narnia. He has a famous distaste for allegory because it gives too much control to the author to determine the meaning of the story. Do we know what Tolkien thought of the allegorical overlay of Narnia?
Well, yes, I think that was another reason why Tolkien disliked what he knew of Narnia, that the allegorical element was too obvious for his taste. But Tolkien was a man who dealt in hyperbole. He would often vastly overstate his opinion. Because he says, doesn't he, in the preface to The Lord of the Rings, he has a cordial or hearty distaste for allegory since ever he developed a nose to sniff it out. And there's no allegory whatsoever in The Lord of the Rings. Well, I don't dispute that about The Lord of the Rings. I think it's not to be read as an allegory. But Tolkien wrote at least 2 allegories. We know that. Leaf by Niggle is an allegory. And he wrote a little allegory in his Beowulf lecture. So, we've got to take Tolkien's strong statements with a pinch of salt. Allegory has a noble place in the history of Christian literature. You might say the parables themselves are allegories. And Piers Plowman and the Pilgrim's Progress and any number of other religious allegories show its value. And I think Tolkien would have accepted that allegory could be done well. It's just it tended to be done in a rather ham-fisted and wooden way, with the purposed domination of the author overwhelming the story and the reader, whereas what Tolkien said he preferred was applicability, residing in the freedom of the reader to assign meanings as they thought appropriate. And that's okay, you know. I think Tolkien and Lewis aren't to be assumed to be on the same page in every respect. They were very close friends, but they didn't see eye to eye on everything. And indeed, the Narnia books, though I use the word allegory of them, they're not really allegorical in Lewis's terminology. They're suppositions, they're not allegories. He wrote one avowed allegory in his own, The Pilgrim's Regress. Narnia was a bit less allegorical, and his final work, Till We Have Faces, is a myth retold, which is very hard to allegorize at all. So you can see a general shift in Lewis's career as a writer, you might say, in a Tolkienian direction. But I don't think he ever gave up his admiration for properly done allegory. It's just hard to do it well.
Thank you. I just was wondering, I mean, the seven heavens, rather, they kind of remind me of astrology. So how does this theory affect the role of free will in Narnia? Because I know he kind of falls upon very Miltonian concepts of free will being the birth of sin. So how does it affect it, if there is any effect?
Well, as I said in my first answer, Christian understandings of astrological influence allowed for influence, for predispositions, for inclinations, but not for determinative outcomes. And that, I'm sure, is what Lewis is meaning to depict as well, that within each story there's Aslan, you might say, is shedding his influence abroad into the Narnian world, into the lives of the children, shaping events to a certain extent, and they have to, what's the right metaphor? They have to blossom under that sunlight, so to speak, rather than shriveling away from it in the darkness. I mean, I think you see it very interestingly and movingly in The Horse and His Boy with Shasta. Now, if I'm right, The Horse and His Boy is the mercurial story, and Mercury is the lord of language, the divine word, the word of God, to put it in biblical terms. And Shasta's whole story, for the first half of the book, depicts him as a pitiable and sad orphan who's cruelly abused by his stepfather and then laughed at by Aravis, and he falls into gorse bushes and he's looked down upon by everybody and snubbed, and he generally leads a terrible life. And then he meets in the mountain pass this large voice, big voice, and he doesn't know who this voice is. He says, "Who are you?" And then the answer comes from this mysterious voice in the mist and the darkness. "One who has waited long for you to speak." That's one of the most beautiful lines Lewis ever wrote, I think. Because finally, Shasta is speaking to the divine word. He doesn't know that it's the divine word in the darkness next to him. Who are you? One who has waited long for you. If only you would speak, speak. And then you will be receiving my articulation, my skill in speech, my mercurial power. Whereas other characters in the story, like the Calamine poets, their proverbs and their poetry are dull and turgid and polysyllabic. They've got no mercurial wit to them at all. They resist all this influence. Now, of course, within a story world, there's no real analogy to free will. Authors sometimes talk about how characters run away with them as they're creating the story. And maybe that's the nearest you can get to the analogy of free will in a created world. But a character who really ran away from the author in a story, that would result in a story which was hardly worth reading, because there must be some authorial control, which is not strictly analogous to God's control over our lives. I think that may be heretical, but that will have to do for now. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I feel confident in saying that this will be the youngest questioner at a Humanities Forum event.
Excellent.
I was wondering what your favorite book is in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Thank you. Yes, good question. My favorite book is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, though I think the best book is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that distinction between best and favorite is a distinction that Lewis himself was very fond of making. That objectively, he said, the best book in his trilogy was Paralandra, but the favorite was That Hideous Strength. I think The Dawn Treader is my favorite because it's a sea story, and I'm a sucker for anything set on the ocean, coming from an island race as I do. That gradual elevation in tone as the story progresses, so that it ends in sort of mystical and mythical heights, having started with pirates and slave trades being overturned and so forth. That growth in the story is beautifully managed. And when you look at the solar imagery, which pervades the story too, then the whole thing is just elevated to an even more transcendent realm, actually. I think Lewis manages to infuse the story with a flavor of something genuinely heavenly, rapturous, ecstatic. He was no mean poet, even in his prose. He knew how to use language and symbol, and I think you can hardly find a better example of that than in the last 3 or 4 chapters of The Dawn Treader.
All right, before we thank Dr. Ward one more time, I'd like to remind you that there will be a reception right over here in the great room, so if you didn't get to ask your question then, you'll have an opportunity then. Please join me in thanking Dr. Michael Ward.